So welcome to the American Resilience Plan, American Indian Resilience in Education, otherwise known as the ARP-AIRE program, reviewer training and orientation webinar. We're going to kick off today with just a quick disclaimer.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
All right, so now that you've been officially disclaimed, know that we will be keeping everybody muted for the most part during the session, but we'll unmute you during the question and answer times so that you can ask any questions that you might have. If you have questions between now and then, feel free to pop those in the chat box. I'll be gathering those up so that we can answer them as the time comes or answering them in the chat box as possible. So you can just place those over in the chat box. Also know that, if for some reason we don't get to your question, just let me know that somehow we've skipped you, put that in the chat box and I'll make sure just in case. And if you need technical support, so if you're maybe having trouble with audio connection, if you happen to get kicked out of the room for any reason, if you're still in the room and having technical difficulties, put that over in the chat box and we will absolutely work with you to get that set up. One of the folks from our team will contact you. If for some reason you get disconnected though, and you're having trouble getting reconnected, just email us at oie@seiservices.com and we'll help you get reconnected. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so we will give you access to that after today so that you can rewatch any parts that would be helpful. And then I'll also place the slide deck over into the chat box so you can have a hard copy either to follow along today or reference after. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to your competition manager, Shala Ortega.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Shala Ortega. I serve as the competition manager for ARP-AIRE. But before I go further, I'd like to first thank all of you for participating in today's webinar and let you know that we appreciate your willingness to offer your expertise and appreciate the time you have committed to serve in this competition. Today's webinar is intended to guide you through the review process and what that process involves, including roles and responsibilities of various participants, program review, and much more. We have a full agenda for today's webinar and a lot to cover. So, but we did include several pauses in the presentation today for Q&A sessions. Just a reminder that today's webinar is intended to serve just as a guide and not a complete picture of what the process is about. We encourage you to read the notice inviting application, the application package, and various other review materials that our contractor will be providing you for a more in-depth review. And we strongly encourage you to read these documents before the review process begins. So here I'd like to go over the training agenda. As you can see, we have a lot to cover. We're going to go over the time management. This is a very important, critical piece of what we do. Review the calendar we have provided for you to take a look at, program purpose and overview, the absolute and competitive preference priorities. This is just this portion, the program purpose and overview, and the absolute and competitive preference priorities, selection criteria. These are all just like providing you some background about the program, what the program is about. You can read more about these areas in a more in-depth fashion by reading the NIA. The roles and responsibilities within the peer review process is something we're going to spend a little more time on. Conflict of interest and confidentiality also is part of that. And then we'll spend a little time on writing comments, scoring applications, G5 system. If you could just move it up a little, the key terms involved. I think that's what it says. Next slide. Time management. Now, this is probably one of the most important aspects of the work you're going to be doing, keeping pace with the review process. I just want to point out a few of these, and I'm not going to go over every single point, but the first thing you want to do as soon as you have access to your assigned panel application, start reading, drafting your response and scores before the panel call or discussions are scheduled. So you want to be prepared with the reading and knowing what your scores and comments drafts are before your discussion takes place as a panel. Be prepared to discuss your comments and scores during the scheduled panel discussion. Be in touch with your panel monitor who's assigned to your panel and keep them informed of any situation that is that you are. Just let them know how you are doing in terms of the progress you're making. Next slide. The panel discussion calls, what we'd like to do, we're going to be conducting these discussion calls or meetings in a Zoom environment, and we'd like to give everyone some room in terms of the call schedules and so forth that is workable and convenient for all. So you'll be working with your panel monitors will be working with you to schedule these meeting times, however, and the call, the actual dates. But please keep in mind that the actual review process cannot go beyond October 2nd. That's our deadline date. And so anything that has to be discussed in terms of the assigned applications, it has to be completed by that date. Next slide. And here's the calendar. Again, this calendar is going to be updated. It gives you an example of what the times could look like. And the dates. It's just an example of how the work is going to be conducted in the next 2 weeks. I just want to kind of use one day as an example. Let's go with Friday, September 18. And for Friday, September 18, for example, I'm sorry, Monday, September, was it? I'm sorry, my screen is covered. Oh, it's Saturday, pardon me. Saturday, September 18, for example, it says PMs and readers. PMs refers to panel monitors, and readers also is another term we use for reviewers. You're expected to complete the conflict of interest form, for example, process. And for the panel monitors, they're going to schedule calls and introductory calls. For the reviewers, you begin reading and writing comments outside of G5. Next slide. If I'm going through these things too fast, please let me know and I'll slow down. So next, we're going to cover give you a basically taste of what the purpose and what the program is about. Next slide. Okay, the purpose of this new program is to support the tribal education agencies, or TEAs, and this is a term the Department of Education uses to refer to certain offices or agencies within a tribal government in the provision of direct services to Indian children and youth. Now, this is a direct service program, and it's a new program. The project must include one or more of the activities that are authorized under Section 6121C of the ESEA. Next slide. And again, this is a one-time discretionary grant competition that was authorized as set by Section 110061 of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Excuse me. And the whole design is to meet the urgent needs of the students in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So these activities are intended to kind of help that, and it applies to a broad range of direct services to Indian children and youth, their teachers, and their families. Again, this is a direct service program, and as part of basically coming to this point, we held a tribal consultation back in April 2021. It sounds like it was a long time ago, but the purpose for that tribal consultation was to get input from tribal Indian tribes, and so the program that is before you for consideration, the applications you're going to be reviewing, the program itself, it had a lot of inputs from the tribal governments and Indian folks, and that's how we designed the program. Next slide. So here's again very quick overview of the program. And eligible applicants are TAs or tribal education agencies or a consortium of such agencies. And there's a definition of what the TA is that we'll come to later. Estimated available funds is $19,800,000 for 3 years. And this is a 3-year project. And with the range of award being $300,000 to $500,000 for each 12-month of the budget period. And average size of an award could be $400,000 for each 12 months. Again, like I said, the project period is 3 years, and we are hoping to be able to award up to 16 grants awards for each 12 months of the project period. And of course, the deadline was the 13th, and we've already passed that. Next slide. And so we're going to go over the absolute and competitive preference priorities very quickly. Next slide. Again, all this is in the notice inviting application. We're just giving you a taste of what it is, and on your own, you're going to be able to read it more in depth. So this program contains one absolute priority and one competitive preference priority. And the reason we did it this way was because it was the funding was from the American Rescue Plan. We wanted to get the funding out as soon as possible. And so we tried to design a program that it did not include a lot of complicated stuff. So we included just one absolute priority and one competitive preference priority. So the absolute priority must be met, like I said, in order for the application to be considered. Now, the applications that you're going to be reviewing have already gone through screening process by the department. So what you're receiving as the applications that are assigned to your panel are applications that have been reviewed, have gone through a screening process. And this is just when we go through the priorities, this is just to give you an idea of what the actual program involves. Next slide. So the absolute priority is basically one of the approved activities based on one of the approved activities on their 6121C in the ESCA. And that was done for a reason. The language was adopted as an absolute priority to emphasize the importance of importance of giving assistance and encouraging Indian children and youth to enter, remain in, or re-enter school at any grade level from pre-K through grade 12. That includes at least one of the following activities we're going to go through. So when you read the application, what you're looking for to see if the applicant has addressed the absolute priority, the language we just went over, in whatever project they propose to do, including one or more of the following activities we're going to go over. So it's not just enough to go to for the applicant to say, well, we're going to just do, two of the activities listed. They have to make sure that it actually speaks to the language that's under the absolute priority. Next slide. So activity number one is basically talks about the educational needs of educational disadvantaged children and youth. The second one is about educational services that are available to such population. and that would include, one or more areas of English, math, science, foreign language, and that includes Indian language as well, art history, and geography. Number three is about the bilingual and bicultural programs and projects. Next slide. Number four is about health and nutrition and addressing the special health and social needs and psychological problems of Indian children and youth. Number five is about comprehensive guidance, counseling, and testing services. Number six is about early childhood education. That's very important, and preparing young children to make sufficient academic growth by the end of grade 3, including pre-K and pre-K programs. Family-based preschool programs, for example, is emphasized here. Screening and referral, and the provision of services to Indian children and youth with disability. Next slide. Okay, so number 7 is about partnership. And the partnership here is between local education agencies, like school districts and LEAs, as they call them, and institutions of higher education for, secondary education school students to enroll in courses at the post-secondary level to help these students in the transition from secondary to post-secondary education. Number 8 is about partnership with between the schools and local businesses for career prep programs that are designed to help Indian youth with the skills necessary to transition from school to a high-skill career. Next slide. So number 9 is designed to help Indian students to work toward and gain entrance into institutions of higher education. And so we didn't want to leave families behind. So number 10 speaks to the family literacy services. And number 11 is about the activities that recognize and support the unique educational needs and culture of Indian students and incorporate the traditional leaders into that education. And finally, number 12 is about the professional development of teaching professionals and paraprofessionals. We didn't want to leave them behind in all this. Now, these are the 12 approved activities from the ESEA that I just mentioned. However, it's not the entire activities that were mentioned in the ESEA, but these were selected and are included in the notice inviting applications. Again, you need to read the NIA for more in-depth information about these activities. Next slide. So that was the absolute priority. And there's, like I said, one competitive preference priority. I just want to remind everyone that as a reviewer, you're not expected to do anything with this competitive preference priority. It's something that we, the Office of Indian Education, assign to applications after they're reviewed and scored. so you don't do anything with this. This is just as an FYI. And the competitive preference priority has 5 points, and it applies to applicants who did not have that are considered novice, and there is a definition what a novice applicant would be. Again, you're not required as a reviewer to do anything with the competitive preference priority, but this is just an FYI, so that you can you know what it is, because it may be referenced in the applications you read. Next slide. Okay, so the next several slides are going to cover the selection criteria. Next slide. So I'm not going to go over every single sub-criterion that are listed under each selection criteria, but I will point out some that I think are important to note. For example, under the project design, for example, the selection criterion number 3, sub-criterion number 3, that deals with the extent to which the proposed project demonstrates a rationale as defined in the notice, and it has 10 points. When you read this, and of course we're going to, we have a definition for demonstrates rationale. It's in the NIA, and we have a definition slide that we're going to get to later. But when you read this, you just have to make sure that it has 10 points. So it's very important for the review of the application to see how that is actually laid out in the application. Now, in the applicants are required, and this is in the notice inviting application, to use a logic model to demonstrate a rationale. So for this piece, you need to also look through the application to see where a logic model has been introduced. And I just want to touch base on that very quickly because it's very important. As you read these applications that are assigned to you, you may find an application that has the logic model as a single attachment, or you may find that an application has kind of woven the logic model into their project narrative in terms of the goals, objectives, and outcomes. You may find an application that has a table, very nicely laid out kind of logic model that you can actually go to. However, the application is put together, whether it's a single logic model or something that's woven into the project narrative, your responsibility is to go to read the application in its entirety to make sure that when you are making comments and scoring the applications, especially for the project design section, like number 3, that you have looked through everything to make sure that you have covered, if there is a logic model that there's, using, that you can actually find it and make sense of it and see if the logic model actually is demonstrating a rationale in terms of the proposed project. So we may have to come back to this at some point again during this, training, but I just wanted to point this out so it's covered. Next slide. Okay, so I talked about definitions. Here are 2 definitions. Demonstrates a rationale, means a key project component included in the project's logic model is informed by research or evaluation findings that suggest the project component is likely to improve relevant outcomes. So if you have an application before you and you're looking to see how they are demonstrating rationale, you may want to look and see if they're using, studies that are done or research that have been conducted, and whether they kind of include that in their project narrative and so forth. And of course, there is a definition for the logic model. I'm not going to go over that. We did not require them to introduce a separate attachment or a clear example of a logic model when we conducted pre-application webinars. We did show potential applicants, interested applicants who attended the webinars, what a logic model would look like, and but we did not require them to use the logic model. It's a logic model, and it could take many shapes. And so, so this is the two definitions that you need to pay close attention to when you are reading the notice inviting application for your review. Next slide. Okay, quality of project services, back to the selection criteria. Again, here the one I'm gonna kind of focus on is number 2. And number 2 has 1 point assigned to it. I just don't want to make sure nobody kind of overlooks that. And it covers basically the strategies for ensuring equal access and treatment for eligible project participants who are members of groups that have been traditionally underrepresented based on race, color, national origin, gender, age, or disability. This has 1 point, and it's very important that as you read these applications, you pay close attention to this aspect as well. Next slide. Quality of project personnel. As you can see, again, we introduced the same kind of framework here as well when we talk about encouraging applications for employment, for example, from persons who are members of the groups I just mentioned, based on underrepresented groups that I just mentioned. And we gave it 3 points. We just want to make sure that applications that are submitted speak to this very important aspect. Next slide. And so the last one is the quality of project management. Again, here you just have a couple of sub-criteria to deal with. One has to do with the management plan that's introduced to how they're going to, achieve the objectives they have proposed in the project, the timeline, and so forth. And the other one is based on the project personnel, experience, expertise, and so on. Next slide. So here is a pause, and I'd like to know if anybody has any questions. Anyone?
And right now we don't have any. If you do have a question, you can pop that over in the chat box and we're happy to answer that now.
So let's give it a few seconds before we move on in case somebody wants to type something.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And while we're paused here at the question time, it is 2 o'clock, so we're 2/3 of the way through our training today.
Thank you. Okay, if you don't see any activity in the chat box, we can move on.
All right.
Okay, now we're going to spend a little time on the roles and responsibilities. Again, this whole orientation is to, we do have a question, actually. Somebody commented something, but
Yeah.
maybe we can cover it during the next Q&A session.
Yes, we can.
Very good, thank you. So we're going to spend a little time on this roles and responsibilities. It's very important to kind of be clear on it. And through this document, you're going to see terms like reviewer, reader, alternate reader. So those are basically terms we use interchangeably. Panel monitor means when we say PM, that's what we mean, panel monitor. So those are basically some of the terms you're going to see. So I hope you don't get confused what PM, CM means. CM means competition manager. And I think we have a definition section or term glossary term at the end of this that gives you sort of a fuller kind of that tells you what these acronyms stand for. Next slide. Okay, this is just a graphic kind of way of showing you what the structure, panel structure is like. So here you have a panel monitor who's an OIE Office of Indian Education staff, very experienced, and they know what they're doing. You've got 3 peer reviewers, an alternate assigned peer reviewer, and one unassigned alternate peer reviewer, who's basically on standby to participate when needed. And of course, the 9 to 12 applications per panel. So all assigned peer reviewers read, score, and have comments for each of the applications in G5. And the unassigned reviewers use Word TRF as template, just to make sure. Next slide. And this is a very kind of a one-stop shop for what the roles and responsibilities are for all the participants involved, including me. So, you can kind of, I'm going to pick one and just go through, but you can, take your time and go through it. We're going to have, several slides past this, one slide that captures each one of these, like for competition manager versus panel monitor and so on and so forth. And show you in a single slide. We're not going to spend too much time on those slides, but this is kind of a way of capturing all of it on one page to show you who's responsible for what and what needs to be done in order for the this review process to be successfully completed. So we can go through one of them, like for me, for example, number 2, no, go back. Number 2 on the chart, it says under CM assigns peer reviewers to panels, reassigns as required, and gets applications to peer reviewers. That's my job. So what happens next for the panel monitor in that same fashion is that the panel monitor sends feedback on completeness, grammar of written comments, scores, and so forth. For peer reviewer, it says screens assigned applications for conflict of interest. Assigned alternate reviewers, it says screens assigned applications for conflict of interest, same as peer reviewer, and drafts using Word TRF template. And then unassigned peer reviewer will be committed to be available through October 2nd, 2021. Next slide. Again, for competition manager responsibility, the same thing that we had on that one chart is included here. I'm not going to go over that. You can take your time and read it later. Next slide. In the interest of time, we just have to go through these slides as soon as possible. Again, here is a list of, again, same thing as the chart we just showed you of, excuse me, panel monitor responsibilities. Very important to read that, to know how it interacts with your responsibilities, interconnects with yours as reviewers. Next slide. Excuse me. And here's where your responsibilities start. And again, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but I just want to make sure that everything you do adheres to what we have listed here, and that you are addressing panel monitors' feedback on comments and revise as necessary, and that you input your scores and comments into G5 system in a timely manner. Next slide. And here's a list of assigned alternate peer reviews on a single slide. Again, we go through this earlier on the chart. Next slide. Unassigned peer review responsibilities. Again, this is the potential reviewer who's ready to jump in when we need to. So it's a standby kind of situation. But these are the sort of the responsibilities that they have once they are selected to serve as the peer reviewer. Then they have to perform as a peer reviewer, and these are the responsibilities associated with that role. Next slide. Okay, and then we also included where our contractor synergy comes in terms of their responsibilities, and they are the contact for troubleshooting Zoom and panel review calls and so on. So here's contact information for them if you need to make that kind of contact. And as far as the G5 portion of what you're doing is concerned, we've included contact information for that as well, for technical difficulties that you may run into. Next slide. How am I doing in terms of time?
You still have 53 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I want to spend a little more time on peer reviewer expectations because it's very important that we're all on the same page on this. We expect you read and consider each assigned application in its entirety. So don't pick and choose, just read one part and think that you basically can cover by just reading that. I know you won't do that, but just be mindful of it. Provide feedback in the form of numerical scores and constructive comments. Draw on your experience and expertise you bring to the table. We don't want you to go outside the application, read things that are outside the application. Don't start Googling for more information. You may have questions about something that the applicant included, for example, about a study they included as an example. You don't want to go Google it to find out if they're actually accurate about it. Just limit your reading to reading the application in its entirety, and then making comments and score them based on what you've read in the application and your comments. Next slide. And of course, everything is confidential while you're reviewing. This is a chart that gives you kind of differentiating the peer reviewer roles. Again, we've already covered this between what the peer reviewer does versus assigned alternate and unassigned alternate. This is just like an FYI as a quick sort of a reference point to go back to if you don't want to read the whole slide about each person's responsibility. Next slide. Yeah. So again, we're going to continue with expectations. Again, very important that you're already willing and able to work with your panel members to complete the project, the review process, and that we want you to be actively involved in the panel discussions, and of course, make sure that you don't have a conflict of interest when it comes to reading the applications that are assigned to you. If you do find that you have a conflict of interest, we'll get to that later. If you have a conflict of interest, you need to notify your assigned panel monitor immediately, and also the synergy folks immediately to let them know, so we can find a remedy for that. Have G5 e-reader experience. If you don't have it, you're going to have difficulty fulfilling your responsibility here. There is a G5 training that you can take to see how to work within G5, and it's online. It's very easy. You can just do it on your own, and but you have to be ready when your panel discussions start, so you know what to do. And of course, have availability and flexibility to commit to the scheduled planned calls and meetings by your panel monitor and your panel to successfully complete the review. And you're expected to comply with all the expectations that we are addressing in the training session and the reviewer moderator guide that you're going to receive. Next slide. And here is some resources you can tap into. We wanted to give you the link to how you can access them, link to the notice inviting application, technical assistance webinars that we did, the pre-application webinars that we did 2 of them, and here's a link to that if you want to take a look. The guide for panel monitors and reviewers that will be sent to you. The training that we're doing today, the slide deck is going to be made available to you if they haven't already done so. It will be done soon. The application package and also the G5 training. It's very I hope this serves as a useful tool for you to tap into if you need to review something and don't know where the link is, or so you can use this as your guide. Next slide. Okay, back to the peer reviewers' role in technical review process. Again, you're responsible for applying the selection criteria to scores and evaluate assigned applications. You don't want to go outside the selection criteria. You don't want to use outside sources. When you're reading an application, just limit it to the selection criteria and what the notice inviting application has included, and also the application itself. The selection criteria or the criteria against which the peer reviewers score each application. And the way, and of course, you need to use a numerical score and also draft written comments of the strengths and weaknesses for each application, and make sure that the scores you're giving to or actually support the strengths and weaknesses that you are writing, that the two support one another. And of course, this is very important because we rely on that to select grantees based on how they're scored. And sorry, somebody's making a chat and it just covers the, okay. So it's very important to pay attention to the scores and comments that you're making, because we're relying on that to make our selection. So it influences what happens next. Again, continuing with the expectation when reading applications and completing your technical review form, we call it TRF, but that's what it means, that if you read the entire project narrative and application. I've said that several times, and I know you are probably getting tired of hearing it, but it's very important you do that. And if you have any conflict of interest with any of the applications that are assigned to you, that you contact either your panel monitor or Synergy, the contractor. You've got the contact information for them to let them know, so we can come up with a remedy. And review only the application that the information that's in the application. Don't go beyond that. Don't start doing your own research about this, that, and the other. If you have any questions, you just limit it to the application before you. And use the selection criteria that are established for this competition and nothing else. Again, your scores and comments must be based on the selection criteria that were selected for this program, and the notice inviting application and the application itself. Again, treat all applications in a fair and equitable manner. I know we have our preferences. You may find that you like some of the applications better than others, but what you don't want to do is compare what you like to what you don't like, and you don't want that influence your judgment when it comes to assigning scores and the comments you're writing. I'm sure you won't do that, but it will have to go through this every time to kind of refresh everyone's memory about what the expectations are. Next slide. Again, we're continuing with this again. I apologize if we're repeating everything several times, but make sure that you have edited and scored any incongruent scoring statements that you have, or syntax problems, or scoring calculations, all that has to be as directed by your panel monitor, because your panel monitor is looking at whatever you submit in G5, and they're doing their due diligence to make sure that if there are issues to be flagged and brought back to your attention, that's what they're going to do. And the expectation is that you respond to that and you make the corrections as necessary. Provide constructive written comments and that provide meaningful information to the applicant. And just remember, we have to have the applicant in mind, because at some point they're going to receive the comments in these TRFs without your name on it, of course, but they're going to want to know how they were scored and what the comments scored. So that would help them with their next attempt for other programs if they want to apply. So try to be as helpful as possible. Do not compare applications, like I said, and just base your scoring and comments based on the application you're reading, not on the one you read you liked or the next one you may read that you like more. Next slide. So here's, we have some time for questions. Let's go back to, do we have any questions? I think we did.
Thank you. So David had asked the question regarding whether they still needed to write comments for the competitive preference priority. And
No.
Donna addressed it in the chat box saying that OIE would address the competitive preference priority. So
Right.
there's no need for the reviewers to write comments addressing it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. Yes, we don't want you to, like I said, the only reason I covered the competitive preference priority portion of the application was because applicants may say something about that in their application. So I just wanted you to be aware of that, but you don't have to do anything about it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yeah, and then Judith asked if they needed to provide the applicant page numbers in their comments. And
Go ahead.
And then the second part of her question was just also if you wanted them to place the number of points not awarded in their weakness comments, for example, 2 points not awarded, and then explain why.
No, that the first part of it, which was, what was the first part? I'm sorry.
The first part was about using page numbers in their comments.
Oh, absolutely. That is so good. And this is a very good question. It's very important for you to use page numbers of where you found what you read in the application. It helps the applicant to know where you found the information you found and you made comments about. So yes, use that by all means. Plus, it's going to help the panel discussion quite a bit, because there may be other panel members who may have questions about your comments. So it would be helpful to kind of direct them. It would be like a roadmap for them to go back and read that section, maybe to see if maybe they read it wrong, or maybe there's something they overlooked and that sort of thing. As far as points are concerned, just stick to what you see on the TRF. Don't introduce your own version of, well, I didn't point 2 points for this section. Just go with what is in the TRF and give points to the sub-criterion, each sub-criterion. And the way you do the points is that, if I have the picture in front of me right now, is that when you're giving it a point, you're giving a point to that particular sub-criterion based on the strength and or weakness that you found in that part of the application. So just stick to that.
Yeah, and we will be covering scoring a bit more shortly.
Right.
Yes, do they use the e-page numbers or the numbers that the applicant used in their application?
It would be helpful to use the EE number, because that is basically what the application does, and that would be extremely helpful to kind of trace it back, not just for you, but for your panel members as well. Because when they're looking at it, they are looking at the e-page. But if you feel like you want to include the page number, for example, the applicant has introduced, you can include that as well. But, use both of them if you can.
Yeah. And then the final question we have right now is the unassigned alternate reviewer compensated for their time?
No, unless they are not, unless they are called on to serve as a peer reviewer. And when they are called on to serve as a peer reviewer, they will be actually serving the function of a peer reviewer, and they will be compensated then, but not before that, not as an unassigned peer reviewer.
All right, well, that is all the questions at this time.
Great, thank you. Good questions. So here we're going to get into the conflict of interest and confidentiality. And Sarah, could you refresh my memory how much time we have left?
Absolutely, we have 38 minutes.
Very good. Next slide. Okay, so let's start with this one particular slide. And what this says is that a reviewer who is not a federal employee, will be considered to have a conflict of interest, or COI as they call it for short, when the reviewer or certain individuals and entities with which the reviewer has a relationship has a financial interest in the outcome of the competition for which he or she is serving as a reviewer. This is just what a conflict of interest, the definition is. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to the conflict of interest, we have, two different kinds basically. One is a direct one and one is an indirect one. A direct conflict of interest is having a financial interest that would be affected by the outcome of the competition. Again, if you're serving as a reviewer and you have a financial interest in the outcome of the competition, that's a conflict of interest. Or helping prepare an application, even if you may or may not have received financial interest in the outcome of the competition. That is also a direct conflict of interest. Or agreeing to serve as an employee or consultant or provide help or advice of any capacity on any project for which the funding is being sought, like in this case, ARP-AIRE program, in any application for this particular competition. So it's not limited to the application that you're reviewing, it's to any application that that is designed to be reviewed for this competition, or has been offered the opportunity to do so and has not yet accepted or declined. So it's not enough to just say, well, I'm not employed by so-and-so, I don't have a conflict of interest. It's very important because, if you have been offered a job or a financial opportunity and you haven't accepted, but you haven't declined it either, then you have a direct conflict of interest. Next slide. So those were examples of actually, that was what the direct conflict of interest is. Indirect conflict of interest is when you have an indirect conflict of interest if any of the following applies to you. One is if your spouse, a child, or a member of your family or household, or any relative with whom you have a close relationship, has a personal financial interest in the outcome of the competition. So this is called an indirect conflict of interest. Or if an employer, any employer that you have served within the last 12 months, a business partner or an organization that you have served as an officer, director, and so on and so forth for the last 12 months, have a personal financial interest in the outcome of the competition. Again, I can't repeat that enough, but it's an indirect conflict of interest, but it's still a conflict of interest. Or any person or organization with whom you are negotiating for or have an arrangement concerning future employment. Again, we talked about that. Any professional associate including any colleague, scientific mentor, and so on and so forth, with whom you are currently conducting research or the professional activities, who may have a personal financial interest in the outcome of this competition in the last 12 months. And that's the duration of your kind of activities with that particular person within the last 12 months. If you had such an activity with that person in the last 12 months, who has a personal financial interest in the outcome of this competition, then you have an indirect conflict of interest. Next slide. Okay, so conflict of interest and tribal membership. This is a very interesting one. And I'm sure some of you are maybe the member of a tribe and are going to be reviewing applications. If you are a tribal member and your tribe is an applicant and you either assisted with the application, whether you had some financial interest or were compensated or not, that's just beside the point. But if you assisted with the application and have a direct financial interest in the outcome of the compensation, then you have to let the panel monitor, your panel monitor know immediately. And you may not serve as a leader for the competition. So that's very important. So please pay close attention to this. So if these two situations apply to you, you need to let your panel monitor know immediately. Now, having said that, we just want to make sure that this is not, doesn't conflict with, say, being a regular tribal member and receiving regular tribal payments. If you receive regular tribal payments because you're a member of the tribe, and the payments are completely separate and unrelated to the grant award, this will not disqualify you from being a reviewer. Okay? But if the payment is in any way affected by the grant, with the program we're talking about, then that is a direct financial connection, and you may not serve as a leader for the competition. Next slide. We're back to peer review responsibilities. I just want to touch base on some of these. I'm not going to go through everything here, but before some of this is repeated, was repeated earlier. Complete the review agreement form to make sure you don't have any conflict of interest issues. And after accessing the application, make sure that you scan through all the applications that are assigned to your assigned applications to make sure that you don't have any conflict of interest, and make sure you confirm that by the due date, and make sure that you or a close family member, do not have a conflict of interest, such as a personal connection, financial interest, and so forth, or professional relationship with any of the applications before you. So if you find any potential conflict of interest, you need to alert your panel monitor immediately. Next slide. So we try to include some examples of what conflict of interest is. So let's just go over this. You may have a conflict of interest as a reviewer if you're involved in any of the following. For example, you're a person or organization with whom you're related or affiliated has a financial interest in any application for the competition you're reviewing for. You've been offered an employment or consultation opportunity by an applicant. You helped prepare or provide comments and advice on any portion of the application that's before you. Your employer has an interest in the outcome of the application. Again, some of this may kind of be repetitious, but we just want to make sure these examples kind of are, put out there for you to kind of clearly say where the conflict of interest can happen. Your spouse or employer may have an interest in the outcome of the competition. Your spouse or affiliated or an enrolled citizen with a tribe that is a lead applicant or project partner. Next slide. Again, this is just to go over this again, discuss the applications only during the scheduled panel discussions. You don't want to take that to outside, especially in the public arena. And you discuss it only when in the presence of your panel members. Do not discuss or share any written comments or scores with anyone outside of the panel review. And you're prohibited to share access to grant applications by unauthorized persons, destroy all applications and notes taken during the review process, including any electronic files or emails related to the review of the application. This is basically after you're done with your review, you need to take care of all that. Next slide. Again, a freedom of information. Here is after the review is completed, a copy of your TRFs with your comments and scores will be made available to the applicant. However, on their FOIA, the public may request to see the TRFs. Of course, we are obliged to provide copies. However, we will not publish your name. Your name is confidential, but your comments and scores will be provided. So just keep that in mind when you are reviewing applications and making scores and making comments and scoring applications accordingly. That it's a public document. Of course, your name will be confidential on each of the TRFs that you do, but everything else on it will be public. So next slide. So here, I'd like to hear if anybody has any questions. Any questions so far?
Currently, we don't have any questions.
Oh, okay. And how are we doing in terms of time?
We have 26 minutes.
Okay, very good. Let's move on.
All right.
Okay, we're gonna spend a little time on writing comments. So go over a few things, actually more than a few things. Next slide. Okay. What we're trying to do is basically be sort of a help. And so kind of provide you with whatever tips we can. And we've been doing this for a number of years. So please don't take it as an insult. I'm sure you do wonderfully in whatever you need to do for the application process, for the review process. However, we'd like to share some tips with you to help you along with the writing part of it. And so here are some tips, for example. For example, you want to explain in some detail why you reached a conclusion or score you've given. I mean, and so by saying something like, this is a good management plan, you're not really, it's not very helpful when something like that is written. Instead, you need to make it clear how you came up with the score you gave and kind of help the applicant understand why you gave it the score you gave. And you need to draw a clear conclusion, for example, that are consistent with the statements you're making and the scores that you're giving. So your written comment and your score should support one another. And use selection criteria language and scoring guidance when you need to actually make your point. Next slide. Again, more sort of what to do with the, when you're writing, evaluate, for example, what the application is saying. Do not restate what you read in the application. That's not a good way of kind of justifying the score you give. Do not copy and paste something from the application in there. Make sure it's actually authentic and it comes from you. And if information is missing from the application, clearly indicate in your comments that the information is missing. However, if you read something in an application, make sure you give some kind of direction to where you found that information. Somebody earlier asked, what kind of page number to use. You can use the application page number or the page number that's used in, say, under the project narrative, or both, to kind of give a map of where you found the information you found. Do not mix strengths and weaknesses. You have to keep them separate. So if you're commenting on an application or a portion of it that sounds like it has some strong points, and you don't want to repeat that or drag it into your weaknesses or actually make references to it under weaknesses. So keep those two separate. Next slide. Again, some helpful hints in terms of some of the choice words you could use when you're writing your comments. Next slide. And again, here's one example of a writing kind of, example. And so it starts with the application proposes using the federally early literacy program in several child care centers within the neighborhood. It is an excellent idea. So what's wrong with this? Well, what's wrong with it is that it simply paraphrases what's in the application, something we said earlier not to do. So the revision could be something like, and this is just suggested out of many versions you could come up with. One of the strengths of the applicant's proposed early learning solutions is that it incorporates the Farber Early Literacy Program in the child care centers that serve a majority of the 3 and 4 year olds, and it goes on like that. So you can see the difference between what it actually is speaking to under the revision versus the top part where it just says, oh yeah, it was great, thank you, and then give it a score. Why is it better like this? Because it explains and it's clear why you gave it the score you gave and how you came about actually coming up with a score. So you're basically justifying the score you're giving by explaining it clearly. Next slide. There's another example again. Just go over this very quickly. The theories of action among the partners are aligned. In addition to the allocation of leadership and responsibilities seems appropriate to the task, and the schedule laid out in the chart seems reasonable. Or what's the problem here? Well, when you read it first, you say, well, there's nothing wrong with it really, but they're not really very helpful, as helpful as they could be. For example, you need to include more detail and explain how the partners are aligned. What do you mean by that? You need to get into it a little deeper and talk about the allocation of responsibilities that you're referencing. So you could do a sort of a partial revision to this. You don't need to rewrite the whole thing, but you can talk about the MOUs and include the page number where you found it, and speak to the MOU and how that basically is addressing the issues you're trying to write comments on, and sort of give it an example of what it is, that it makes sense to kind of suggest what the applicant is proposing to do with the project, to split the day in this way or that way. So you have a basis for the comments you're making by referencing the MOU and what was involved in that and giving a page number. In that way, you're making it very clear about the specific parts of what the alignment was about and why the leadership plan is appropriate and reasonable. I hope this example helps you when you're writing your comments. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to go over scoring the application. And how much time do we have, Sarah?
We have 18 minutes.
Okay, let's move on. Next slide. Okay, scoring applications. Again, as you saw for the selection criteria, you have different points assigned to different sub-criteria and different selection criteria. So be mindful of that. And there is a range of points that you can give. So make sure you use the range. And it is perfectly acceptable to assign a score of either 100 possible points for a criteria or 1 point even. But you have to make sure that you justify the points you're giving it. So just make sure you do that. If, for example, you assign 0 point to say a sub-criterion, then you need to explain why that is in your written comment, say for weaknesses, for example. So there's a guiding rule that you need to use in order to be consistent in rating all the applications in the same way. So if you find an applicant who's given a 0 point for something you didn't find, but and that may pop up in another application where the applicant has done the same thing, just make sure you remember how you assign points when you didn't find what you were looking for. So you're consistent with not just one application, but in the way you score all the applications that you're reviewing. So next slide. And this is basically to show you, an example of what can happen, what can go wrong, basically. Not that you're going to be experiencing it, but it could happen. And this just gives you what type of problem could occur and describes what it is and makes recommendation on how you can remedy it. For example, length could be a time. So some people may think that the longer somebody writes it, the better the quality, but really that may not be the case. You probably want to make sure that it's quality that you are, you're introducing according to suggested scoring guidelines, for example, and that the length of the application is not an accurate determination of the quality. So that's just an example of some of the problems that you may run into. Repetition factor is another one that maybe you read 6 applications and you think they all sound the same, but you want to make sure that you read each application based on its own merit and that you're reading the entire application before you make a decision on how to write your comments. That's very important, and that you're not comparing one application to another, in terms of your own, take on what the applicant is proposing. So next slide. More about the common scoring errors. I don't want to go over all of them, so I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of what you could run into. You probably, if you served as a reviewer, you probably run into some of these already, but it's good to kind of have it as sort of a reference point to see where, what you may run into again reviewing this program. Next slide. Okay, and what you see before you is just a suggested point range. It's not an absolute point range. It's not designed for this program specifically. It's just a suggested point range that if you have a maximum point of 1. So how do you score it in terms of whether it's addressed or not, whether it's poorly developed or adequately developed or well developed or fully developed, kind of. So it's just to help you kind of place your comments in terms of, or scoring in terms of how you're actually making your comments and how you can score to make sure that the score supports the comment you're making. Next slide. Again, this gives you a description of the previous slides, kind of headings, what fully developed and well developed and so on mean. For example, a fully developed response shows a clear understanding of the criterion requirements, and the response not only addresses the factor, but also shows alignments between what is proposed, how it'll be carried out, and what the impact is going to be. So if you give it a full score, then you want to make sure that it's addressing, it gives you a complete picture of what they're going to do on their particular selection criteria. And a 0 point, just to emphasize, is a response that means that the requirements were not addressed at all anywhere in the application. So again, going back to the point I was making earlier, make sure you read the entire application, including the attachments. So if you come up with a 0 point and then someone else in your panel finds that actually there was something mentioned somewhere, then you have to be flexible to go back and review what you read to see if that actually holds true. And I'll adjust whatever comments or scores you've given accordingly. Next slide. Again, more scoring tips in terms of language and how, how comments could be written. Next slide. Okay, so this is just to help you to navigate through panel discussions. And I know we have our highs and lows and, issues like that. I know I have them. I know as a human being, everyone has it. So just exercise patience and be mindful of other panel members who may or may not be experiencing the same situation you are. And it's very important to ask others to explain their positions and be an active listener. And we don't want you to fade in the background and just have one person kind of dominate the discussion in panel discussions. We want everyone to be actively involved and understand what is being said, actually. So, and be receptive to changes. If someone suggests a change, please don't take it as an insult. It's just to help guide the review process and answer if there are any questions posed in terms of if someone comes in a discussion session, for example, someone asks questions about how did you manage to kind of come up with this comment and so forth, can you explain it? Try to be as open as you can and help them understand how you actually came up to, kind of write what you wrote and, the score you have given. But keep that in the back of your mind. Keep this in mind that that all of us have to go back and kind of review and reposition and revise and kind of adjust to the changes that we have to kind of work with as a group. So you are a group as a panel, and you have to be respectful of each other's strengths and weaknesses as well, and trying to work cooperatively with each other. Next slide. Oh, good question. All right.
Yeah.
Do we have any?
We do. So the first question is, if an application has multiple files like attachments with it, how can the reviewers access those?
You should have received applications with all the attachments that were attached to that application. So you don't have to go look for it anywhere. I believe that applications that are going to be provided to you to access will have all that incorporated. Am I correct, Sarah? I think Synergy is going to be taking care of that.
I'm not sure, but I can verify that.
Okay, great, thanks. And if you as a reviewer have any issues with accessing an attachment, please let your panel monitor know. Also, you need to contact Synergy to let them know so they know, what the problem is and, kind of jump in to help.
And I did get verification that yes, Synergy as the logistics coordinator will send those as a package.
Very good, thank you. So you shouldn't have any problems accessing any attachments that may be included with the application. But if you do, make sure you troubleshoot it to your panel monitor or your Synergy. Synergy is the best, first source to go to, so they can help you. Next question.
The next question is, should we break down our comments by each criterion using, say, like 1, 2, 3? And if they don't award full points for a section, should their weakness comment note the criterion that's not receiving the full points?
I'm not sure. I need clarification about that. I'm not sure what they mean by breaking down points for each criterion. So give me an example if you could. Just type it in the chat box.
Yeah. So David, if you want to pop that in the chat box, I'll go to the next question from Bonnie. Will we get the applications today?
Well, we're in the process of making all that happen as soon as possible. That's the best way I can put it.
Yeah.
But this has been, we are under a time crunch and we've been doing our best to meet everyone's expectations. So that's all I can share with you. Hopefully we can, and hopefully you'll be able to see something by the end of the day, but I can't promise that because it's a, how shall I put it? Work in progress, so we'll see what we can do, but we'll do our best. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I did get some just further clarification on the files thing that
Sure.
yes, there may be certain applications that do have multiple files because of not converting properly, but they will all be together in the same file. So it'll be nice and easy for you to find. And I don't see where David had clarified on his question. I think he's just asking in regards to those where the full thing has, say, 50 points, but then there's smaller things within.
Well, yeah, if you have a sub criterion, say 1, 2, 3, right? Each one, you really need to write to the strengths and weaknesses of each sub criterion. You don't want to lump all of them together as one general kind of piece. You want to separate them because when you each sub criterion has a certain number of points, assigned to it. So you need to be very clear how you are scoring and commenting. I can't tell you enough how important it is, not just to us when we go to consider these applications for, later on for the next phase, but also to the applicants who are ultimately going to receive a copy of your comments and scores, not with your name on it, but you're going to receive a copy and they're going to need clarification. Well, how did you score this versus that? So when you're reading, for example, project design, and there are, and I don't remember off the top of my head how many sub criteria you have under that, but there are like maybe 3, 4 sub criteria listed under project design. You want to take each one and respond to each accordingly. And for example, one of the sub criteria on the project design is talking about demonstrate rationale. So you need to talk about that. You can't just drop it. So that's the best way to approach it. It may be a little harder, but it'll be extremely important and critical for what happens next when, with the review process.
Right. So it does sound like it might be helpful to go ahead and label those sub-criterion, 1, 2, 3, just to make it really clear.
And use this, you could use the language of the, actually it's on your TRF. The language of the sub-criterion is in your TRF. So the way the technical review form is built in G5, when you go to enter, whatever you do off, G5, when you go into G5 to enter your comments in the TRF on the form, you have to divide them because they're divided in the TRF in terms of comments, strengths and weaknesses, and scores for each sub-criteria.
Great. All right, so it looks like that is the last of our questions, so we can go to the next slide.
Okay. And here's some things about the G5 system and how to basically contact to, there's a training in G5 that takes you through how to work in G5. I'm not an expert in that, but I do encourage you strongly to take a look, even though you may have done this and you think you're familiar with it. G5 is again a kind of a live kind of a laboratory kind of environment where they're always updating and changing and so on and so forth. And so it's important for you to kind of know, so you don't get stuck with well, maybe something changed and you don't quite know how to work it. So take a look at the reviewer training they have. It's an online training and it's easily accessible. And you can just go and take a look at it and see if anything changed, or if, just, refresh your memory in terms of how to work in G5. And in terms of applications reviews, again, you review your application, submit a save TRF, and update and submit a previously submitted technical review form. This is all what you can kind of go through to make sure you understand how to do all this. This is all in G5, and how to update conflict of interest status, and it just covers quite a bit, that G5 training. So it's helpful to kind of take a look and familiarize yourself with it. If you don't complete this training, you will not be able to serve as a reviewer for this competition. So maybe you have already done it, but you probably want to do it again and make sure you're taking care of it. And if you have any questions, again, there is a 800 number you call for technical help. Your panel monitor and your and Synergy are there, but actually G5 is a much more technical kind of area. You need, if you're taking online training in G5, you need to contact G5 if you don't need to an issue there. Next slide. And here are some terms we use and definitions for them, what the competition manager is, what G5 is. G5 is a web-based grant system that we use. We've used it for many years, and it's used to access applications and many other things we do, including peer review. Next slide. Oh, well, we are at the end of our presentation here. So we'd like to hear from you. I think there's a survey that Synergy will be sending your way to see if this webinar was helpful.
And it's just super simple. We're just asking a quick yes, no using the reaction buttons. If you've never used the reaction buttons before, you should see them at the bottom of your screen where you've been accessing the chat box. And it'll give you the option for a little green check mark or a little red X mark, letting us know whether you feel prepared now to serve as a peer reviewer. So if you don't mind taking a quick moment to vote, just helps us make these better and better as you do more peer reviews in the future. And with that, I know we're right at time. So we just wrap here with the contact information for your competition manager, Shala. That's her email address, as well as we have our OIE email address here. If you need to reach out to Synergy with any questions, with anything that comes out throughout the review process, you're welcome to email and we'll get you connected with the right answer. We also have the link to the Office of Indian Education website, as well as if you're on Twitter, we have a brand new this year OIE Twitter that you can follow at OIE Indian Ed. If you have any final questions, please place those in the chat box. We want to make sure you get all of your questions answered. And if you don't have any questions, have a wonderful weekend and happy reviewing.
Thanks, everyone.